I'm 84 years old now, and for 40 years I've been keeping a secret that challenges everything science accepts about human evolution and our relationship with this planet. Hidden in a bunker beneath my property in the Cascade Mountains, I protected the last of an ancestral species that most people believe exists only in legends and blurry photographs. His name was Calder. At least, that's what I called him, because it was the sound he made when he was in pain. And he was a living, breathing link to humanity's forgotten past. I found him dying in 1984, when I was just 44 years old and thought I understood the boundaries of what was possible. This is the story of how a man of science chose compassion over career, and why I finally decided to tell the truth before age and guilt take me to my grave. I tell you this from my study, surrounded by 4 decades of journals documenting the most important anthropological discovery in human history, a discovery that only 3 people have ever known about. My hands shake as I write, not just from age, but from the weight of carrying this truth alone for so long. Outside my window, the October maples are turning the same fiery colors they were 40 years ago, when my life changed forever. Some might call me crazy. Others might call me a fool for not sharing this with the scientific community. But I know what I protected, what I loved, and what I lost. And before I die, the world needs to understand that we are not alone on this planet, and that our species has systematically destroyed civilizations we never bothered to acknowledge. October 15th, 1984. Ronald Reagan was president. Purple Rain by Prince dominated radio stations across America, and the first Macintosh computers were appearing in university labs, though most of us still typed our research papers on IBM Selectrics. I was Dr. Marcus Whitmore, 44 years old, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Washington with a growing reputation for my work on Pacific Northwest indigenous remains. I'd been living alone for 3 years, ever since Sarah died of breast cancer, retreating to the isolation of a 20-acre property in the Cascade Mountains that I'd inherited from my father, a logger who'd worked these forests for 40 years. The log house sat 45 minutes from the nearest town of Granite Falls, surrounded by dense groves of Douglas fir and western hemlock that stretched to the horizon. No neighbors for miles, no phone lines running this far into the mountains. Just me, my research, and the kind of silence that makes city people nervous. I'd been using the property as a retreat between field expeditions, cataloging archaeological finds and preparing correspondence courses for the university. That particular autumn, I was working on a paper about tool-making techniques among coastal Salish peoples, spending my days surrounded by pottery shards and arrowheads laid out on my dining room table like pieces of an ancient puzzle. The morning started like any other. I made coffee in my enamel percolator, listened to the 6 a.m. news on my transistor radio, something about the Soviets boycotting the Olympics in Los Angeles, and planned to spend the day photographing obsidian blade fragments. The air was crisp with that sharp October bite that turns your breath to mist and makes the forest smell like wood smoke and dying leaves. I was eating breakfast when an unnatural wind began moving through the trees outside my kitchen window. Not the usual autumn breeze, but something cold and wrong that seemed to silence even the crows that normally filled the morning with their raucous conversation. Around 2 p.m., while organizing field notes in my study, I caught a smell drifting through the open window. Something putrid and sweet, like meat left too long in the sun. Living this far from civilization, you learn to investigate unusual odors. They usually mean a dead deer or bear that could attract scavengers to your property. I grabbed my Coleman lantern and a shovel, thinking I'd need to bury whatever I found before it drew coyotes, or worse, a hungry black bear looking for an easy meal. The smell led me down a ravine about a quarter-mile behind the house, through undergrowth thick with devil's club and salmonberry bushes that caught at my jacket as I pushed deeper into the forest. The odor grew stronger with each step, that sickly sweet stench of decomposition that makes your stomach turn and your eyes water. I followed a game trail that deer had worn into the hillside, my boots slipping on wet leaves that had begun their autumn transformation from green to gold. When I first saw it, lying motionless in a depression between two fallen cedar logs, my rational mind tried to categorize it as something familiar. A bear, maybe, or an elk that had died of natural causes. But as I got closer, raising my lantern to cut through the shadows, the details began to assault my scientific understanding one by one. The limbs were too long, the posture too upright. The hands were enormous, with thick fingers that could only belong to something that walked on two legs. It was a biped, approximately 9 feet tall, covered in thick, dark, reddish-brown hair that was matted with blood and forest debris. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the chest deep and massive, but it was the face that stopped my breath entirely. Not human, but not ape either. Something in between, with a heavy brow ridge, a broad, flat nose, and features that seemed to bridge the gap between our species and something far more ancient. The creature lay on its side, apparently dead for several days based on the smell and the flies that swarmed around deep gashes across its chest and abdomen. The wounds looked like claw marks, probably from a bear defending its territory or cubs. My first instinct, trained by years of archaeological fieldwork, was to document everything. This was the discovery that would revolutionize anthropology, paleontology, and our understanding of human evolution. I was looking at what could be a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, a living fossil that had somehow survived in these remote mountains. I positioned my lantern over the creature's face to get a better look at its skull structure, and that's when I saw it. Just a slight condensation in the cold evening air. A barely perceptible mist forming near its nostrils. My heart stopped, then hammered so hard I could hear it pounding in my ears. The creature was breathing, barely, so faintly I might have missed it entirely, but it was alive. In that moment, I faced an impossible choice. If I called the authorities, the university, my colleagues, this being would become a specimen. It would be studied, tested, dissected. It would spend whatever remained of its life in laboratories and research facilities, poked and prodded by scientists who would see it as the find of the century, rather than a living, breathing individual. If I tried to help it myself, I'd be risking everything, my career, my reputation, maybe even my freedom. I knelt beside the creature in the gathering darkness and made a decision that would define the next 40 years of my life. I was going to save it. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. I hiked back to the house and loaded my pickup truck with everything I could think of. First aid supplies, blankets, rope, my father's old logging chains, anything that might help me transport a 9-foot-tall injured creature without killing it in the process. The physical logistics alone seemed impossible. The being had to weigh at least 600 pounds, maybe more, and I was a 44-year-old academic who spent more time hunched over artifacts than doing manual labor. It took me until well past midnight to rig a travois, using my father's old deer-hauling equipment, and drag the unconscious creature the quarter-mile to my barn. Every few minutes I'd stop to check if it was still breathing, terrified that my attempt at rescue would end up being an exercise in moving a corpse. But each time, I'd see that faint mist forming around its nostrils, proof that whatever this being was, it was still fighting to survive. Once I had it sheltered in the barn, I could finally examine the injuries properly. The claw marks were deep, some of them down to what looked like ribs, and infection had clearly set in. The creature's breathing was labored, its skin hot with fever. I had basic medical training from my army days in Vietnam, enough to recognize that without antibiotics and proper care, this being would be dead within days. I spent the next week essentially playing frontier veterinarian, using everything from horse antibiotics to hydrogen peroxide to fight the infection. I set up a space heater to keep the barn warm, brought in fresh straw for bedding, and began what felt like a hopeless battle against sepsis and organ failure. For the first 5 days, the creature remained unconscious, its breathing sometimes so shallow, I was convinced I'd lost it. Then, on a foggy morning in late October, I entered the barn to find 2 enormous brown eyes watching me with unmistakable intelligence. The creature was awake, alert, and absolutely terrified. When it saw me approaching with medical supplies, it tried to back away, making a low, guttural sound that raised every hair on my arms. It was too weak to stand, but even lying down, its size was overwhelming. Those massive hands could crush me without effort if it chose to. "Easy," I said softly, the way you'd speak to a frightened animal, though I was beginning to suspect this was no animal at all. "I'm not going to hurt you, I'm trying to help." The creature's breathing was rapid, panicked. Its eyes darted around the barn, taking in the unfamiliar environment, the strange smells, the reality of being confined and helpless. When I knelt down and reached for the bandages I'd wrapped around its torso, it made a sound that was unmistakably a word, repeated over and over. "Calder, Calder, Calder." "Calder," I repeated, thinking it might be trying to tell me something. The creature's eyes focused on mine with sudden intensity, and it touched its own chest with one massive finger. It was telling me its name, or at least what it wanted me to call it. "Calder. That's your name, isn't it?" The creature, Calder, nodded. An actual, deliberate nod of acknowledgement. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about intelligence, consciousness, and what it means to be human underwent a fundamental shift. I wasn't just treating an injured animal. I was meeting another person. Over the following weeks, as Calder's physical wounds healed and his strength returned, we began the delicate process of communication. It started with simple gestures, pointing to objects and repeating words. Basic yes or no questions answered with nods or shakes of his massive head. But Calder's capacity for learning was extraordinary. Within a month, he understood dozens of words in English and had begun creating his own gestural language to communicate concepts that human speech couldn't accommodate. What amazed me most was his intelligence. Calder could use tools, solve problems, and demonstrated what could only be described as scientific curiosity. He would watch me repair equipment, memorizing the steps, then later attempt to replicate the process with objects of his own. He understood cause and effect, planned ahead, and showed clear emotional responses to different situations. By Christmas of 1984, Calder was not just healthy, he was thriving. I'd converted my father's old workshop into a living space that could accommodate his size, with reinforced furniture and heating adequate for Washington winters. But more importantly, we'd developed what could only be called a friendship. Calder had become my companion, my research partner in a study of interspecies communication that no university would ever sanction. The decision to keep Calder's existence secret became final when I received a visit from Forest Service agents in January 1985. They were investigating reports of unusual animal sightings from hunters in the area, asking questions about large tracks and strange vocalizations that had been reported throughout the previous autumn. I listened to their questions with mounting dread, realizing that discovery would mean the end of everything Calder and I had built together. That night, I explained the danger to Calder using the collection of picture cards and gestural language we'd developed. He understood immediately. Humans in large numbers meant capture, confinement, separation from the mountains that were his home. We began work on an underground bunker system that would connect to the barn, a hidden refuge where Calder could retreat if authorities or curious visitors ever came too close. The years that followed were unlike anything I could have imagined when I first entered academic life. My official research continued. I published papers on Pacific Northwest prehistory, attended conferences, maintained my position at the university. But my real work was happening in secret, documenting the language, culture, and intelligence of a species that science insisted didn't exist. Calder proved to be a remarkable teacher. Through our evolving communication system, he shared fragments of knowledge that challenged everything I thought I knew about North American natural history. He drew maps in the dirt showing where others of his kind had once lived, vast territories that stretched from Alaska to Northern California, reduced over generations by human expansion and environmental destruction. He taught me to read signs in the forest that I'd never noticed, subtle markers that indicated the presence of large, intelligent creatures living parallel to human civilization. But perhaps most significantly, Calder taught me about loss. Through gesture and expression, he conveyed that he believed he was the last of his kind, that the others had gradually disappeared over his lifetime until he found himself completely alone. The wounds I'd treated when I first found him weren't from a bear attack, as I'd initially thought. They were from a final, desperate fight with hunters who had tracked down and killed the last members of his family group. Calder had escaped, barely alive, into the deep forest where I'd discovered him. The isolation we shared created a bond that transcended species. We both knew what it meant to be alone, to carry knowledge and memories that no one else could understand. In the evenings, I'd play my father's old piano, Bach mostly, which seemed to calm Calder during the fierce winter storms that terrified him, while he sat nearby, sometimes humming along in that deep, resonant voice that could perfectly mimic any sound he heard. By the late 1980s, our routine had become domestic in ways that would have seemed impossible when I first brought Calder home. He helped with maintenance around the property, his enormous strength making tasks like splitting firewood almost effortless. He developed preferences and opinions about everything from food to music to the books I read aloud during long winter evenings. His favorites were illustrated astronomy texts. He would study the photographs of distant galaxies with the same intensity most people reserve for television. One night in 1992, during a blizzard that knocked out power lines throughout the region, Calder saved my life. I'd gone outside to check on the generator and collapsed in the snow, overcome by carbon monoxide from a faulty exhaust pipe. I woke up hours later inside the house with Calder sitting beside my bed, having carried me inside and somehow managed to restart my breathing. He'd risked exposure to the storm and his own safety to rescue me, proving that the capacity for sacrifice and loyalty isn't limited to human beings. But the outside world continued to intrude on our sanctuary. In 1989, a team of cryptozoologists set up camp for 3 weeks on neighboring property, conducting scientific research into Sasquatch sightings. I spent those weeks in a state of constant anxiety, monitoring their movements through binoculars and creating elaborate cover stories for any sounds or evidence they might discover. Calder remained hidden in our underground bunker system, emerging only at night for exercise and fresh air. The 1990s brought new challenges as technology advanced and the world grew smaller. Satellite imaging became more sophisticated, making it harder to hide modifications to the property. The internet made it possible for amateur investigators to coordinate searches and share information about sightings. I found myself constantly adapting our security measures, installing motion sensors and camera systems to monitor approaching visitors, creating false trails and decoy evidence to lead searchers away from Calder's hiding places. In 1997, when Calder was clearly entering middle age and I was approaching 60, I made a decision that could have destroyed everything we'd built together. I needed help, both with Calder's increasingly complex health needs and with the demands of maintaining absolute secrecy while aging myself. After months of internal debate, I reached out to the one family member I still trusted completely, my niece, Dr. Elena Whitmore, a geneticist at the University of British Columbia, who had inherited the family trait of stubborn ethical principles. The revelation happened during the Christmas of 2009, when I suffered a minor heart attack and was hospitalized for 4 days. Elena had driven down from Vancouver to check on me and arrived at the property to find clear evidence of a second occupant, enormous footprints in the snow, furniture sized for something far larger than human, and food stores that could only feed someone of massive appetite. When I returned from the hospital, Elena was waiting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and a look I remembered from her childhood, the same expression she'd worn when she'd discovered me hiding Christmas presents in the barn 25 years earlier. "Uncle Marcus," she said quietly, "we need to talk about your house guest." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. I watched Elena's face cycle through disbelief, anger, scientific fascination, and finally, after I introduced her to Calder himself, something approaching awe. She spent 3 days at the property, observing, asking questions, gradually coming to understand the magnitude of what I'd been protecting. Elena's background in genetics proved invaluable. She was able to obtain medical equipment and supplies through her research connections, giving us access to diagnostic tools and treatments that my primitive first aid knowledge couldn't provide. More importantly, she gave me someone to share the burden of secrecy with, someone who understood both the scientific implications and the ethical complexities of our situation. Dr. James Chen joined our circle of trust in 2014, when Calder developed a respiratory infection that threatened to become pneumonia. Chen was a retired veterinarian who specialized in large mammals, and Elena convinced him to make a house call under the pretense of treating livestock. His reaction to meeting Calder was similar to Elena's: initial shock followed by professional fascination, and, eventually, deep respect for both Calder's intelligence and the commitment Elena and I had made to protecting him. Our small family of protectors worked well together. Elena handled medical monitoring and research, Chen provided veterinary expertise, and I served as Calder's primary companion and translator. We established schedules for visits and care, backup plans for emergencies, and protocols for handling any situations that might threaten exposure. For the first time in decades, I felt like the responsibility wasn't mine alone. But even with help, the passage of time was becoming our greatest enemy. By 2015, both Calder and I were showing our age. His thick hair had turned silver around the face and shoulders, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting arthritis and joint pain. My own health was declining as well. Heart problems, diabetes, the inevitable consequences of spending 30 years under constant stress and isolation. Calder's intelligence never diminished, even as his body weakened. He continued learning, developing new ways to express complex ideas through our gestural language and picture card system. He created art, arranging stones and branches into patterns that seemed to represent star constellations or forest maps. He showed empathy and emotional depth that many humans never achieve, comforting me during my worst moments of guilt and loneliness, celebrating small victories and peaceful days with childlike joy. One of my most treasured memories comes from a summer evening in 2018, when Calder and I sat on the back porch watching a thunderstorm approach across the mountains. Lightning illuminated the clouds in brilliant flashes, and thunder rolled through the valleys like distant artillery. Calder, despite his fear of storms, had insisted on staying outside with me. As the rain began to fall, he reached over and took my hand in his massive palm, and we sat together watching nature's display of power. No words were necessary. We were two old friends sharing a moment of beauty before the storm arrived. The crisis that changed everything came in March 2019. Calder had been fighting a persistent cough for several weeks, something Elena and Chen had been monitoring carefully. But on a cold Tuesday morning, I found him collapsed in the bunker, barely conscious and struggling to breathe. His temperature was dangerously high, and his breathing was so labored that each breath seemed like it might be his last. For 72 hours, our house became an intensive care unit. Elena smuggled experimental antibiotics and oxygen equipment from her university lab. Jen provided round-the-clock monitoring and treatment protocols. I stayed at Calder's side, talking to him constantly, playing Bach recordings on a portable stereo, doing everything I could to anchor him to consciousness and the will to fight. The worst moment came on the second night when Calder's breathing stopped entirely. Elena was adjusting the oxygen mask while Chen monitored his pulse, and suddenly, there was nothing. No rise and fall of that massive chest. No sound except the electronic beeping of monitoring equipment. Without thinking, I positioned my hands on his sternum and began compressions, pushing down with all my strength on a chest the size of a whiskey barrel, trying to restart the heart of a being whose anatomy I only partially understood. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, Calder gasped and resumed breathing. His eyes opened, focusing on mine with an expression of profound trust and gratitude. He was going to survive, but we all understood that this was just the beginning of the end. Calder's body was failing, and there was nothing our small family could do except make his remaining time as comfortable and dignified as possible. The final years were bittersweet. Calder's world gradually contracted to the confines of the bunker and the immediate area around the house. He could no longer make the hikes into the deeper forest that had always renewed his spirit. His appetite diminished, his sleep became restless, and his once perfect mimicry abilities began to fade along with his hearing. But his mind remained sharp, and his emotional connection to our small family never wavered. He continued creating art, now focusing on drawings that seemed to represent memories, crude but recognizable sketches of forest scenes, animals, and figures that might have been his lost family members. He developed new gestures to express concepts like thankfulness and peace, and his eyes retained the warmth and intelligence that had first convinced me he was a person rather than a specimen. Elena and Chen visited more frequently during these final months, helping with daily care and providing the medical support that kept Calder comfortable. We discussed the inevitable openly, planning for dignity rather than intervention when his time finally came. None of us wanted Calder's final moments to be spent surrounded by machines and medical procedures. He deserved to pass naturally, surrounded by the people who loved him. On August 23, 2024, exactly 40 years to the day after I first found him in that ravine, Calder woke me before dawn with a gentle touch on my shoulder. I'd been sleeping in a chair beside his bed, something I'd done frequently over the past months. He gestured for me to sit beside him, and when I did, he took my hand in both of his massive palms and held it against his chest, just over his heart. Elena arrived within an hour, having driven through the night from Vancouver after I called her. She brought Calder's favorite music, a collection of Bach's Brandenburg concertos that we'd played for him countless times over the years. As the sun rose through the windows of the bunker, painting everything in golden light, Calder listened to the music with his eyes closed, breathing slowly and peacefully. Around noon, he opened his eyes one last time and looked at each of us in turn. To Elena, he made the gesture for daughter, which he'd developed years earlier to express how he thought of her. To Chen, he offered the formal nod of respect they'd established when they first met. To me, he touched his forehead to mine, the gesture of deepest affection and trust that had become our equivalent of an embrace. Then he reached under his bedding and pulled out something he'd been working on in secret, a piece of bark on which he'd scratched a primitive but unmistakable drawing. It showed two figures, one large and one small, sitting together under a canopy of stars. At the bottom, he'd drawn what could only be interpreted as a heart. It was a representation of our friendship, created as his final gift to me. Calder passed away that afternoon as Bach's music played softly in the background. His breathing simply slowed, then stopped, so gently that for a moment I thought he was just falling into deeper sleep. There were no final words, no dramatic moments. Just a peaceful transition from life to whatever comes after, with the three people who loved him most, holding his hands and speaking words of gratitude for the privilege of knowing him. We buried Calder in a clearing he'd always favored, about half a mile from the house, where the morning sun filtered through a cathedral of Douglas firs and western hemlocks. Elena and Chen helped me carry him there wrapped in blankets, and we spent the afternoon digging a grave, deep enough to ensure he would never be disturbed. I placed his final drawing in his hands before we covered him with earth, and Elena left wildflowers that matched the ones Calder had always gathered for the bunker during his healthier years. The months that followed were the loneliest of my life, lonelier even than the years after Sarah's death. The silence in the house was overwhelming after 4 decades of companionship. The bunker, once filled with the sounds of Calder's breathing and movement, became a tomb-like space that I could barely enter. Elena and Chen visited regularly, worried about my mental state and my ability to care for myself, but they understood that grief for a friendship like ours couldn't be rushed or easily comforted. It took me nearly 6 months to begin this account, 6 months to find the strength and clarity to put into words what Calder's life and death meant. As I write these final pages, winter is approaching again, and I can feel my own mortality more clearly than ever before. At 84, with a weak heart and arthritis that matches what Calder suffered in his final years. I know I don't have much time left to tell this story. What did I learn from 40 years with the last of his kind? I learned that intelligence and consciousness take forms we barely recognize, that family can be defined by choice rather than genetics, and that some scientific discoveries are too important to exploit without considering the ethical implications. I learned that our species has systematically destroyed civilizations and cultures that we never bothered to acknowledge, that our expansion across this continent came at costs we still refuse to calculate. Most importantly, I learned that Calder was never just a specimen or a discovery. He was a person, different from me, certainly, but a thinking, feeling individual with fears and hopes and the capacity for love. He deserved the same dignity and respect we claim to value in human beings, and he received precious little of either from the world that would have claimed ownership of him. If I had it to do over again, would I make the same choice? Without hesitation. The 40 years I spent with Calder were the most meaningful of my life. Yes, I sacrificed career advancement, professional recognition, and the chance to make history in the academic world. But I gained something far more valuable, proof that friendship and love can transcend every barrier we think defines us. I'm 84 years old. I protected the last of an ancient human species for 40 years, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Because some discoveries are too precious to share with a world that would only seek to exploit them. Some friendships matter more than fame or scientific advancement. And sometimes, the most important thing a human being can do is recognize the humanity in something that doesn't look quite like us. Calder taught me that we're not alone on this planet, that intelligence takes many forms, and that consciousness doesn't require technology or human language to be valid and valuable. He taught me that love transcends species boundaries, that family can be chosen rather than inherited, and that dignity is something every thinking being deserves regardless of their origin. If you take anything from this account, take this. The world is stranger and more wonderful than we imagine. In the deepest forests, in the most remote mountains, there may still be others like Calder, waiting to see if humanity will evolve enough to deserve knowing them. They deserve our protection, our respect, and our recognition that intelligence and consciousness belong to more than just our species. And if you ever find yourself with the choice between exploitation and protection, between fame and friendship, between what benefits you and what serves something greater than yourself, choose compassion. Choose the harder path. Choose to protect what can't protect itself. Because 40 years from now, when you're old and facing your own mortality, you won't regret the sacrifices you made for love. You'll only regret the chances you didn't take to make a difference in someone's life. Even if that someone has fur and stands 9 feet tall and comes from a world we thought existed only in legends. Calder was real. His friendship was real. And his memory will outlive both of us, a testament to the possibility that different doesn't mean dangerous, and that intelligence comes in forms we're only beginning to understand. He deserved better than what this world would have given him. But he got 40 years of love, dignity, and protection from 3 people who chose to see him as family rather than specimen. That's enough. It has to be enough. And maybe in some small way, it's a beginning.